My name is Henry Ashford, though, if I am being honest, that name matters very little. It could be any name, belonging to any man who once walked the gaslit streets of London at the end of the 19th century. What matters is not who I am, but what I carry, what countless men like me carried in silence. London, 1890. I was 26 years old when I understood, with a clarity so sharp it cut through bone, that my very existence was considered a crime. Perhaps I had always known it, half-formed like a shadow flickering at the edge of thought. But on that night, walking alone through Bloomsbury under a heavy veil of fog, it settled in me as certainty. To desire another man was not simply forbidden, it was ruin. The lamps hissed along the pavements, spilling weak halos into the mist. Horses clattered past with carriages behind them, wheels rattling against the cobblestones. The city looked as it always did, respectable, industrious, proud. But, as I walked, the truth pressed against me like an iron cage. I was one of those men, the kind the newspapers called perverts, the kind preachers damned from their pulpits. One careless step, one misplaced word, and the world would tear my life apart. I suppose I should tell you how it began. At 12, still a boy in Eton collars and ink-stained fingers, I discovered the first stirring of it. His name was James. Bright hair like ripened wheat, a laugh that disarmed the cruelest master. We sat side by side over Latin conjugations, our elbows almost touching, and when his hand brushed mine by accident, a current leaped through me so fierce I feared the others might see it in my face. That night, pressed into the narrow dormitory bed, I whispered his name into my pillow, as though it were sacred. Fear followed quickly behind the discovery. At school, rumors of boys who went astray circulated like poison. They were expelled, disgraced, whispered about as diseased, unnatural. I understood, long before I understood much else about life, that silence was my only protection, and so silence became my companion. By the time I reached manhood, I wore it like a second skin. I worked in an office, respectable in affligious correspondence, neat rows of figures that marched obediently across paper. To the world I was a proper Victorian gentleman, polite, God-fearing, industrious. I even courted a young woman for a time, a neighbour's daughter with kind eyes. But every kiss I placed on her hand felt counterfeit, every promise hollow. I smiled, I bowed, I played my part, and all the while, within me, the storm gathered. London itself both fed and mocked that storm. The city was alive, restless, endlessly shifting. Street vendors cried their wares. Hansom cabs careened dangerously close to pedestrians. The roar of life never ceased. To an outsider, it was progress incarnate, the beating heart of empire. But if you knew where to look, you could glimpse another Londoner shadow city hidden in alleys and parlours, in rented rooms above coffee-houses. There were places where men like me gathered, where desire could be spoken with glances and half-smiles, where we could pretend, for an hour, that we belonged to ourselves. But before I found those places, I carried my secret like contraband, terrified of discovery. The law was merciless. The Labouchere Amendment of 1885 had broadened the crime of gross indecency to include nearly anything between men, even in private. It required no evidence of force, no complaint of harm, only suspicion, exposure, a whisper passed to the wrong ear, and you could be hauled before the courts, imprisoned, and branded for life. That fear sank deep into me. Every laugh that lingered a beat too long with another man felt dangerous. Every glance across a crowded room seemed like a risk. I lived as though on stage, constantly rehearsing my lines, ensuring my mask never slipped. The loneliness of such existence is difficult to explain. It is like being surrounded by a crowd that speaks a language you can never learn. You watch the ease of others, men who court women, who fall in love openly, who build families without fear, and you feel both invisible and exposed. Invisible, because no one sees the truth of you. Exposed, because if they did, they would destroy you. And yet, despite the terror, dreams came. At night, in my narrow rented room, I allowed myself to imagine, what would it be like to hold a man openly, without fear? To kiss him in the sunlight, to walk arm in arm down Oxford Street, as lovers do. Dreams were dangerous, but they were also my only warmth. One evening, passing the Serpentine in Hyde Park, I saw two men standing close together, shoulders nearly touching. One laughed softly, the sound carrying across the still water. For a heartbeat, they seemed free to souls unshackled. The sight made something inside me ache with longing, but almost at once the fear returned. I thought of the scandals splashed across newspapers, of names dragged through mud, of families ruined. I thought of men like Oscar Wilde, praised as geniuses one day, condemned as degenerates the next. Shame grew in me like rot. It was not only the fear of punishment, nor the hatred of society, it was the belief, planted in me since childhood, that I was wrong at the root, that my heart itself was diseased, that love, for me, was never love but corruption. Alone in my room, I sometimes faced the cracked mirror and whispered, "Who are you, Henry Ashford, a sinner, a criminal, or simply a man who loves?" The mirror offered no answer. There were days I thought of leaving England altogether. I heard whispers of tolerance in Parisian, of freer circles in Berlin, but money bound me to London, and cowardice as well. And in truth, I knew no place on earth where one could love another man without fear. Still, small mercies came. The glance of a stranger, held just long enough to say, "I see you, I am like you." The brush of a hand that lingered an instant longer than necessary. These fragments sustained me, crumbs of recognition in an otherwise barren existence. And so, though I lived in silence, I began to believe I was not alone, that perhaps my story, my suffering, belonged to something larger. Hidden chorus of voices drowned by law and shame, yet persistent, enduring. That is why I speak now. Not because I am unafraid, but because fear has shaped me long enough. My tale is not unique. It echoes through countless others whose names history erased. But if you hear it, if you truly hear it, then perhaps our silence was not in vain. I am Henry Ashford. I am a man who loved where he was forbidden to love. That is my crime. That is my truth. And though London still watches with judgment in every gaslit shadow, I choose to begin here with confession. For if I cannot be remembered as I lived, then let me be remembered as I truly was, a man in the heart of the Victorian age, carrying a forbidden love like a secret flame in the fog. This is my story. I was born in 1864 in a narrow brick house on the edge of Islington, where the smoke from the factories seemed to settle more thickly than anywhere else. My father was a clerk in a shipping firm, and my mother a quiet woman who filled our home with the smell of boiled potatoes and starch. Ours was not a wealthy family, but respectable enough, and they wanted nothing more than for me to walk a straight path. Education, employment, marriage, children, church on Sundays. A simple destiny, laid out as neatly as the rows of ledgers my father brought home. But life, as I would learn, rarely obeys the lines we draw for it. As a child, I was small and sickly, the sort who preferred books to footballs, who listened more than he spoke. My mother worried I was too delicate. My father worried I was too soft. "Henry," he would say, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder, "you must learn to be a man in this world. There's no place for dreamers." But I was a dreamer, and my dreams betrayed me before I even knew what they meant. It was James, as I told you, who first awakened in me the truth of myself. We were 12, sitting side by side at long desks in a schoolroom that smelled perpetually of ink and chalk. He had a way of laughing under his breath during lessons, a quiet rebellion that both terrified and thrilled me. When his hand brushed mine, it was as though the world tilted. That evening, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, my chest tight with something unnamed. I did not have words for it then. Boys teased each other about crushes on girls, passing folded notes that smelled faintly of perfume, daring one another to speak to the butcher's daughter. I laughed with them, pretended interest, but none of it stirred me. Instead, I found myself stealing glances at James, memorizing the slope of his jaw, the way his hair caught the sunlight through the high windows. It was not lust, not then. It was a kind of reverence, an aching need to be near him. But whispers at school were dangerous. Older boys spoke of unnatural friendships, and we all knew what that meant. Shame, punishment, expulsion. Once, a boy 2 years above me was sent away without explanation, his name never spoken again. I saw the headmaster's face, grim and tight-lipped, and though no one said it aloud, we all understood. From that day, I knew that what I felt must be hidden, even from myself. And so began my education, not just in Latin or mathematics, but in secrecy. I trained myself to glance away quickly if my eyes lingered too long. I practiced laughing at the right moments when girls were discussed. I even forced myself, once, to walk a girl home after church, though my palms sweated and my voice cracked with every step. She smiled at me sweetly, and I wanted desperately to feel what my friends seemed to feel. But there was only emptiness where affection should have been. As adolescence deepened, the emptiness grew harder to disguise. My body betrayed me in ways my mind did not yet understand. I began to dream at night, restless dreams of hands on skin, of warmth pressed close in the dark. Always, the face was blurred, but the body was not. Always, it was a man. I woke ashamed, my sheets damp, my heart pounding as though I had committed a crime in my sleep. I prayed, of course. My mother raised me in the Anglican faith, and I knew the verses well. I knelt at my bedside, whispering, "Lord, take this from me, make me clean." But each morning I awoke the same, the prayers unanswered, my shame heavier. The church taught that lust itself was sinful, but desire for one's own sex was more than sex, was more than sin, it was abomination. Sermons thundered about Sodom, about fire and brimstone, about men consumed by their own wicked appetites. I sat in the pews, pale and silent, and wondered if the preacher somehow saw me through the crowd, if he knew. By 16, I had become an expert at invisibility. My teachers praised my diligence. My parents admired my good behavior. Outwardly, I was everything they wanted me to be. Inwardly, I was a battlefield. There were moments, though, when the mask cracked. Once, in the library, I found a book of Greek poetry, its pages worn and annotated. I remember the shock of reading verses that spoke of love between men, not with condemnation, but with beauty. The words of Sappho, translated clumsily, spoke of desire like fire beneath the skin. My hands trembled as I read, afraid someone might look over my shoulder. But no one did. And in that secret corner, I felt, for the first time, that my feelings were not new, not monstrous. They were ancient, as old as the stones of Athens. Another time, I caught James staring back at me across the schoolyard, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he knew, as though he shared the same forbidden secret. But then he laughed with his friends, turned away, and the moment was gone. He never spoke to me beyond polite conversation, and soon enough our paths diverged. Yet his memory lingered like a phantom, a first spark never fully extinguished. When I left school at 18, I carried with me not only my certificate, but also a private burden of longing. My father secured me a clerkship in the city, and I took to the work with diligence. Columns of numbers, rows of letters, all neat and obedient. But my thoughts strayed, wandering to imagined embraces, to the curve of a shoulder glimpsed as a colleague removed his coat. I learned to bury these thoughts quickly, to force my mind back to ink and paper. Still, the hunger gnawed at me, insistent. I tried, as many young men did, to cure myself by courting women. My parents encouraged it, especially with the neighbor's daughter, Emily. She was kind, gentle, with soft brown eyes. We walked together along the canal, spoke of books and weather. She held my arm, and I smiled, but each smile was borrowed, a counterfeit coin in a counterfeit courtship. When she looked at me with expectation, I felt only guilt. Eventually, she married another, and my parents shook their heads in disappointment. I pretended to be heartbroken, but inside, I was relieved. What I could not admit, even to myself, was that I was searching for something entirely different. It was in those years, my late teens and early 20s, that I began to hear whispers of another world. Men spoke in careful tones of taverns near Leicester Square, of private rooms above certain coffee houses, of parks after dark where one might find companionship if one knew the signals. At first, I dismissed such talk as rumor, but the longer I lived with my loneliness, the more those whispers grew like a siren's call. Still, fear kept me at bay. The newspapers were filled with stories of scandalsmen arrested in raids, their names splashed across headlines, their lives ruined. The law was merciless, the public even more so. To be caught meant prison, disgrace, and an exile from society itself. I told myself it was better to endure loneliness than risk annihilation. But desire is a stubborn thing. It does not vanish simply because it is forbidden. It waits, it whispers, it presses against the edges of silence until silence itself cracks. I remember one night in particular, when I was 21. I had stayed late at the office, copying figures by lamplight until the building emptied. As I stepped into the foggy street, I saw another clerk, Charles, a man a few years older than I, walking a short distance ahead. He paused, glanced back, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Something passed between us in that look, something I cannot fully explain. Not words, not even a gesture, but recognition. I see you, you see me. We did not speak. He turned a corner, and I let him go. But that night, I lay awake, my body restless, my mind alive with the possibility that I was not alone, that somewhere in this vast, suffocating city, others like me lived, suffered, longed. And so, slowly, cautiously, I began to search. That search the hesitant steps into London's hidden world. The first taste of companionship, mingled with fear, was the beginning of another chapter, one that would bring both joy and ruin. But before that, in the long years of my youth, I lived in the shadows of discovery, learning myself in fragments, finding reflections in forbidden books, in fleeting glances, in the ache of dreams. It was a lonely education, but it was mine. I was Henry Ashford. I was young, uncertain, and hungry for a love I did not yet dare to name. And though the world called it sin, though the law called it crime, in my heart it felt like truth. If youth was a classroom of secrecy and self-denial, then my 20s became a slow descent into the hidden chambers of London, a city that had always seemed respectable by daylight, yet revealed its other face by night. I did not stumble into that world all at once. It began with whispers, with rumours exchanged in the office when the senior clerks were away, or in taverns when the ale had loosened tongues. They spoke of certain places, taverns, where men lingered in ways too close for friendship, coffee houses where private rooms could be rented discreetly, parks where, after dark, the rustle of leaves carried more than the sound of wind. Most men dismissed such talk as scandal, gossip meant to shock, but I listened differently. To me, those stories were like doors creaking open. I resisted for months, even years. Fear remained my truest companion. Every time I considered seeking such a place, I thought of the headlines splashed across newspapers. Arrest at Cleveland Street. Men of influence in vile indecency, shocking depravity uncovered. Each article destroyed reputations, families, lives. The names of those arrested became fodder for ridicule, their faces caricatured cruelly in the illustrated press. To be caught was not only to lose one's freedom, but to be erased as a human being. And yet, loneliness is its own prison, and it has a way of urging one to risk everything just to feel the warmth of another. The first time I dared, I was 23. A colleague, Charles, the one whose glance had lingered on mine outside the office, invited me for a drink at a tavern near Leicester Square. Its name I will not repeat, though I remember every detail of it. The low ceilings stained with smoke, the scent of gin soaked into the floorboards, the hum of conversation that faltered when newcomers entered and resumed once they had been judged safe. Charles led me inside without explanation, as though he expected me to understand, and perhaps I did. The air itself felt different, charged, alert, as though every man there carried the same secret. Some leaned close over tables, their voices low, their laughter too intimate. Others stood in corners, eyes scanning, waiting. I felt exposed and exhilarated all at once. We did not speak of it directly. We never would. But Charles brushed my hand as he passed me a glass, and I knew, that night, though nothing more happened than shared conversation and lingering glances, I walked home with my heart pounding as though I had been kissed. It was not long before I returned, alone this time, trembling with both anticipation and terror. Each time I stepped through those doors, I feared it would be the night the police raided, that my name would be inked into ruin. But each time, the need overcame the fear. It was there, in that dimly lit tavern, that I first met William. He was older than I by several years, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled at the edges. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that drew others to him, yet his eyes, when they found mine, held a gentleness I had never known. He spoke little at first, asking my name, offering me a drink, but something in his presence eased the constant knot of tension inside me. Over weeks, then months, our conversations grew. We spoke of books, of politics, of music, but beneath every word ran an undercurrent neither of us dared name. Until one evening, when we slipped from the tavern and walked together through the fog. At a narrow alley, he paused, looked at me, and without a word, touched my hand. That touch, simple, fleeting, was the most electrifying moment of my life. For the first time, I was not imagining, not dreaming. It was real. From then on, we met whenever we could. always in secret, always with caution. A rented room above a coffee house, dimly lit and smelling faintly of roasted beans. A secluded bench in Hyde Park after dusk. Once, even in the back room of the very office where we worked, though the fear nearly undid us both, I will not pretend our love was free of shame. Each embrace was shadowed by the fear of discovery. Each kiss carried the weight of a crime. Yet within those moments, I felt more alive than I had ever thought possible. His arms around me were a sanctuary, a rebellion, a truth I had long been denied. William was not reckless, but he was braver than I. He spoke openly, at least with me, of his refusal to live in fear. "They call it a crime," he said once, his fingers tracing mine, "but what harm is there in love? If this is sin, then I will sin gladly." I envied his courage, even as I doubted it could last. For I had seen too many lives ruined, too many names dragged through filth. "They will destroy us," I whispered once. He only smiled, kissed my brow, and said, "Let them try." It was through William that I discovered more of London's hidden world. He knew of gatherings in private rooms, where curtains were drawn tight and laughter flowed freely. He introduced me to others like Usman, of all classes, clerks, artists, soldiers, even a barrister. Each had learned the art of disguise, the careful double life. By day, they were dutiful sons, husbands, employees. By night, in these hidden corners, they were themselves. There was joy in it, yes, but also sadness. For every story of love, there was another of betrayal, men caught in police raids, lovers separated by blackmail, lives ended in despair. The shadow of fear never fully lifted. Yet in that shadow, community formed. We were not alone. And that knowledge itself was a kind of salvation. My time with William was both the happiest and the most perilous of my life. He was patient, teaching me that desire need not be only shame, that intimacy could be tender as well as urgent, that I was not diseased, not broken, but human. For a time, I allowed myself to believe we might have a future, even if only in stolen fragments. But the world has little mercy for men like us. One evening, as we left a gathering at a friend's rooms in Bloomsbury, we were followed. A group of youths, drunk and jeering, shouted obscenities, their words dripping with the venom of the newspapers. We escaped unharmed, but the incident left me shaken. I realized how fragile our safety was, how easily the veil could be torn. Yet despite the danger, I could not turn back. Once you have tasted love, true love, silence becomes unbearable. Looking back now, I see that those years were both a gift and a curse. A gift because I discovered love in its most honest form, untainted by the falsehood of forced courtships. A curse because every joy was shadowed by the threat of ruin. And yet, if you ask me whether I would choose differently, I cannot say that I would. For in William's arms, I learned the truth of myself. I was Henry Ashford. I was a man who loved another man, not in theory, not in secret longing, but in living flesh and breath. And though the law called it vice, though society named it sin, in my heart it was nothing less than sacred. That love, fragile and forbidden, was the beginning of everything. For a time, I dared to believe that our secret world could endure that, so long as William and I were careful, so long as we kept to shadows, no one could tear us apart. Love, even forbidden love, makes one foolish. It convinces you that stolen hours can last forever. But nothing hidden remains so forever, not in London, not in the year 1895, when the city seemed ravenous for scandal. It began not with us, but with whispers in the newspapers. Stories of arrests at Cleveland Street, of young telegraph boys lured into indecency by men of influence. Each headline sent a shiver through our circle. We told ourselves it was distant, that it would pass, that respectable men like us could not be touched. But in truth, the noose was tightening. The public had developed an appetite for such stories, hungry to condemn, to sneer, to devour reputations in the name of morality. I remember the day it began for me as clearly as if it were carved into stone. William and I had arranged to meet in a rented room above a coffee house in Bloomsbury. It was late, the streets cloaked in fog, our usual disguise. We entered separately, cautious as ever, yet when I reached the door, something felt wrong. The landlady, usually indifferent, avoided my eyes. Upstairs, in that small, dimly lit room, William waited with a smile that steadied me until the door burst open. Two men entered, plainclothes officers, their faces grim with purpose. Behind them, the landlady hovered, pale and tight-lipped. I remember the sound first, the sharp crack of boots on the wooden floor, the scrape of the lock as they shut us in. Then the words, cold and precise, "Gentlemen, you are under arrest for gross indecency." The world tilted. My heart hammered in my chest, not with fear alone, but with disbelief. We had been careful, so careful, yet it had taken only one betrayal, one whisper to the wrong ear, to unravel everything. They took us separately, as though we were already criminals. The cell into which I was thrown smelled of damp stone and despair. Hours passed, how many, I cannot say. My thoughts spiraled. My parents, my colleagues, the newspapers. The shame would not be confined to four walls. It would spill into every corner of my life. When at last I stood before the magistrate, the charge was read aloud. Henry Ashford, accused of acts of gross indecency with another man. The words themselves felt like shackles, each syllable a blow. The room was full, not only officials, but onlookers, eager for spectacle. I felt their eyes pierce me, strip me bare. I wanted to shout that I had harmed no one, that I had only loved. But my throat was ash. Bail was denied. The days that followed in prison were a blur of filth, cold, and silence. Other prisoners jeered, some whispered, others stared. I kept my head low, clutching the thin blanket as though it could shield me from their gaze. The guards treated me with contempt, barely veiled. One spat near my feet and muttered, "Filth." And then the trial. I am an old man now. The Henry Ashford who once walked those gaslit streets of London, heart hammering with both terror and longing, seems like a ghost that lives only in memory. My body has grown frail. My hair is white where it once was black. My hands, once steady enough to copy ledgers without a single blot of ink, now tremble as I lift a teacup. I have lived many years beyond the prison gates, though not the life I imagined when I was young. And yet I still carry the weight of those days, the shame, the fleeting joys stolen in secret. They have shaped me more than any job, any church, sermon, any family duty ever could. After my release, the world did not welcome me back. I became a wanderer of sorts, moving from one lodging house to another, never staying too long. Work was scarce. Once your name had appeared in the papers under such a charge, doors closed. I took what I could, counting for small shops, assisting with inventories, odd clerical tasks that no respectable man wanted. My parents aged quickly under the strain of disgrace. My father never looked me in the eye again. My mother spoke to me in hushed tones, as though any word might betray her to the neighbors. My younger brother avoided me entirely. When they died, I stood at their graves, not as a son mourned, but as a shadow tolerated at the edge of the family plot. Friends were gone. Some cut ties to save themselves. Others drifted away, unwilling to be associated with scandal. Loneliness, once my prison, became my companion. But life, stubborn thing that it is, continued. I read. I walked. I kept journals no one would see. And though William was lost to me, whether by choice, by exile, or by death, I never learned his memory remained. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I imagined him still alive somewhere, perhaps in Paris or Berlin, walking along a riverbank, carrying within him the same flame that once warmed me. As the years passed, I watched the world change. Slowly, haltingly, but undeniably. I remember the trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895, how the newspapers feasted on his ruin, how men whispered in taverns that it was the end of decadence. To me, it was déjà vu, the same humiliation, the same spectacle, the same merciless appetite for scandal. Yet, in Wilde's defiance, in his words, "The love that dare not speak its name," I heard an echo of my own life. I wept reading them, for I knew exactly what he meant. The world did not change overnight. For decades, men like me lived in silence, in fear, in exile. Some married women, hiding their truth for the sake of respectability. Others lived double lives, seeking love in the shadows while wearing masks by day. Many, too many, ended their lives in despair, unable to bear the crushing weight of secrecy. And yet, the silence did not remain unbroken. By the middle of the 20th century, whispers turned into voices, voices into movements. Men and women began to speak aloud what I had never dared. They protested, they wrote, they demanded recognition. I read of them in newspapers and journals, astonished, fearful for them, yet filled with a strange pride. They risked openly what I had only lived in whispers. I will not live to see the world fully transformed. I am too old, my years nearly spent. But I have glimpsed enough to believe that change is possible. Laws once written to erase us have begun to crumble. Young men now hold hands in streets without fear of prison, though still with the risk of scorn. It is not freedom entire, but it is more than I ever knew. Sometimes I wonder, what would my life have been if I had been born a century later? Would I have walked openly with William, kissed him beneath the daylight instead of the fog? Would my parents have known me as I truly was, rather than as the shame they refused to name? It is a foolish game, perhaps, to imagine another time, another world. I lived when I lived. I bore what I bore. But I tell this story now, in these last years, because I want it remembered. Not for myself, Henry Ashford, clerk, convict, shadow, but for all of us whose names history forgot. For the boys who whispered prayers at night, begging God to take away what was never a disease. For the men who walked the streets alone, glancing furtively, desperate to know they were not alone. For the lovers who met in taverns and parks, clutching joy with trembling hands, knowing it could be ripped away at any moment. For William, whose courage outshone mine, and whose fate I never knew. Our stories are not written in the history books. They are buried under silence, under shame, under the polite lies of a society that pretended we did not exist. But we did exist. We loved, we suffered, we endured, and in the end, that is what I want you to know. I am Henry Ashford. My name, perhaps, will be forgotten, but my truth, I pray, will not. I lived in the heart of Victorian England, a world that called me criminal for the simple act of loving another man. I was judged, imprisoned, disgraced. And yet, despite it all, I loved. that love was my crime, that love was my salvation. So if you remember nothing else of me, remember this: love, any love freely given, cannot be shame, it cannot be filth, it cannot be crime. It is the most human thing we possess. If my voice reaches you now, across the gulf of years, then perhaps I am no longer silent, perhaps none of us are. And if some young man, somewhere, hears this story and feels less alone, then my life, my suffering, my shame, my love will not have been in vain. The fog of London still hangs in my memory, the hiss of gas lamps, the echo of boots on cobblestones. But beyond that fog, I imagine a dawn, a world where no one hides, no one whispers, no one is dragged in chains for the simple act of loving. I will not see it with my own eyes, but I believe it will come. This is my testament, my confession, my truth. I am Henry Ashford, and I loved.